The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Shimmering skyscrapers, modest homes, inspiring and uninspiring public places. Architecture shapes the space we occupy. All week we'll learn how with architects Eladia Smoke, Geishigaba Week, Carol Phillips, Marianne McKenna, and Don Schmitt. Tonight, balancing form and function. That's next on the Agenda in the Summer.
Every weekend, you will find me on my couch watching a particular channel that's always talking about homes and gardens.
Oh, yeah. Right.
I won't say the channel just in case it's like a conflict. But you always hear this thing of people talking about a house has good bones, right?
Right.
And this idea that if something was built a long time ago, it's much better than the things that are built now. Yesterday, we started talking about, the difference between good architecture and good urban planning, and I wanted to just kind of continue that thread a little bit. Carol, what's more important, form or function of a design?
Oh, has to be a dialogue between the two.
Is this a controversial thing to say, or?
No, I don't think it's controversial. Yeah. I think it's perhaps controversial if we talk about something we talked about before, which is sort of the commodification of our buildings. And so there is a big period when we talked about just iconic buildings, and that was what the project had to be. It had to be remarkable. It had to be a feat of engineering. And really, I think you can't talk about that without talking about the space that you're creating within that. So the dialogue between the function of the space, we can't talk about space mattering and not referring to the function. And the shaping of that space comes from the form. And we talked as well about the public realm and the impact that buildings have on the air around them and the space around them and the street around them. And so the form of that building starts to inflect the public realm. So I think that it has to be a dialogue between what the form of a building, what it looks like, what it says, what the face, literal facade is the face. What is that communicating? And the threshold to the public realm is part of that dialogue between the housing the functionality of that building and its purpose to serve its community, but also what that form does to the corollary space outside.
I'd love to hear, sorry.
Yeah, so it's a dialogue.
It's a dialogue?
Yeah.
I'd love to hear the thoughts from everybody else. Don, is it form
function? Definitely over form. When I think of the Royal Ontario Museum, the new edition, that represents a kind of significant problem in my view in architecture.
What is that?
Because the architect began with a sculptural proposal that has no regard for what's exhibited on the interior, and it's actually a kind of really problematic in terms of the kind of role of the museum in society as a kind of place to engage with with history and storytelling and artifacts is negated by the interior of that building. The kind of public process of moving through the building, in my view, is problematic. And the imposition of a form, an abstraction that's disconnected from what the building is about, but also disconnected from the public realm. Because architecture is, the making of buildings is what we're all involved in, but the making of space between buildings to create the public realm is very much what we're involved in, and you can't turn your back on the reciprocity between those two things.
Is that why you say it's an imposition?
It's an imposition in that there's a kind of hostility with the way that building deals with the public realm. We live in a climate of ice and snow. The ice and snow cascades down that building onto people who are walking by. There's just kind of, it's I think problematic in its preoccupation with form in the first instance. I mean, I'm using it just as a kind of way of illustrating the point. But that sense of shaping the public realm is just as important. And I think it's another area where architects haven't been as good as we should be in really understanding that, whether it's community space, whether it's garden space, whether it's park space, recreation space, or the kind of street, the place of gathering and meeting and connecting with one another as a community, those spaces are just as important. And each building in a certain way contributes to that relationship in an urban setting. In a more less dense setting, the relationship between building and landscape is of critical importance, as others have mentioned, but definitely function.
It's really
But
interesting.
I think that's why I mention it's a dialogue, because
Right.
you can't ignore the form. I think that if we define form as being we have to make something exciting, then it absolutely follows the function. It should not be the thing that trumps the functionality. But I believe that it is a dialogue between the shaping of that public realm. So you cannot ignore it. It's a dialogue between the two. In my
And
mind.
it's not inconceivable to get everything in balance. I'll tell you a funny story about a competition we went into where the president of Boston University asked for an iconic building. Now, we're Canadian. We don't really respond to that. So we think, well, why does he want an iconic building? Because Boston University is 1.5 miles along Commonwealth Avenue. There's not a building of distinction. There's a little CERT building, which is about 10 stories. And then right across the river is MIT. And so this was the president's way of actually creating a forum that would speak to MIT and to have a program for data and computer sciences that would be a competitor, if not the kind of the best faculty in the United States would be housed in this iconic building. And so he gave it to us as architects. But as you say, the public realm is very important. The base of the building, how it interacts. So how you locate the functionality, the student-related spaces, the classrooms, the teaching spaces, and how this tower goes up is very, I don't need to describe it to you, because the next time you're in Boston, you'll actually see it from anywhere, because we actually drove our camera all around the city in a 3D model to see if you could see. He said, can you see it from here? Can you see it from here? You could see it from everywhere, because there's nothing else on that street. So anywhere you can see. So I think we say form follows function, but in very often you need the form to actually excite, to attract. It is part of the magnetism of the building, and getting it right within its context and also public realm, and that the functionality that you create environments in which researchers can actually create neighborhoods and can walk all the way up the building, because there's an open stair that runs through, and the building actually shifts around that stair. So your relationship to the typical floor plate, which is typical usually in this case, because the building's moving around that staircase, you're getting different environments. So it was a really challenging, but I think as it was a competition with the best U.S. architects, and the moment the president saw it, he said he recognized iconic.
Right.
So challenge.
What about you, Eladia? Form or function?
So I'm thinking of this little utilitarian building that won a Toronto Urban Design Award. It's a water processing facility, right? The little angular one. And it's sad to me that architects have relinquished such a big part of the building, undertaking marketplace, because, when you get an architect that has sensitivity involved, even in a little water treatment plant, you get this wonderful little gem-like structure. And it's so beautiful to see. It's like in this very out-of-the-way place. It's not in a beautiful site or anything, but it's just lovely. And it brings delight, and attention to something that might not get much attention. So like form and function are intrinsically linked. So if you look at like one of my favorite architectural typologies, which is the Plains teepee, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and Plains Cree sort of use this structure, and it's been refined over the course of many millennia to be absolutely efficient in every way and really suited to its environment, so much so that even Anishinaabeg Nation around the Great Lakes use it because it's just so good. And so it's like it expresses the tensile forces with the originally buffalo hide, now often canvas skin. It's laid in an egg shape so that it takes the prevailing winds on the sort of tapered end. It looks like a circle, but it's actually ever so slightly egg-shaped in plan. And then you have these poles that are very easy to transport. You can stick them on a pickup truck, or back in the day, a horse, or even back in the day, a dog team. And, very portable. And it can be hitched up like skirts in the summertime to take the breezes and just become a shade structure. It can be tamped down in the winter with a dew cloth and insulation layer. You can heap snow up on the sides of it to insulate it even further. And it's just so suited to its function, to its environment. It uses easily renewable resources, very low impact in all of the embodied energy it represents. And furthermore, it's ephemeral. So if you are done with the components of that teepee, you can just give it back to the places it came from, and it right away reintegrates into the environment. So
the thought process of that design is just like kind of blows your mind. We wanted to kind of take this opportunity to kind of, give you a chance to spill your secrets, if you're willing. What is your process like when you're thinking of a design, Don?
I think, the process of design is a kind of fairly patient exploration and investigation that involves research. It involves listening to your client.
Do you ever get like something like writer's block? Where
I don't, luckily.
Yeah. John's like, no, not me.
We're working now on a new wing of the Art Gallery of Ontario. It's roughly the size of all the exhibition space at the Whitney Museum in New York. And it's devoted to global contemporary work. In other words, work from Indigenous people across this country and the continent, the diasporas in Africa, Southeast Asia. And so the kind of process of listening and conversation, at the same time, it's inserted into this very kind of leftover odd service space on this amazing campus of the Art Gallery of Ontario, which is an entire city block, and it has to rise 7 stories in order to accommodate the program. But the whole process of over months discovering where do you connect it into this, the existing circumstance of the gallery. How can you solve the problems of dead ends in public circulation that the gallery has now? We've designed it all from the inside out. And it's been a kind of very patient discovery. And finally, we pop out back to the exterior, and there's a kind of form that has emerged, a bit shaped by the cardinal points, working with Brian Porter, a fantastic Indigenous architect who's been a joy to collaborate with, finding the points of view out of this largely exhibition space to the east, to the west, north and south, to the sky, to the ground. How can we make outdoor sculpture terraces that relate to Grange Park? And how can we clad it in a clay that is glazed, that is, Toronto clay, catching light from the sky, changing its luminosity, and finally you emerge with this sort of really totemic or sculptural presence. It has a very powerful sculptural form and identity that is separate from, the Art Gallery of Ontario's Gary Wing, the kind of blue titanium, and Will Alsop's OCAD building, very iconic buildings on either side. We're kind of in the middle. But it's a sort of patient process of exploration and discovery and editing and curating the process, and something great emerges.
And again, so many different layers. Carol, what's your design process like?
My process starts with walking the site. I think that
You do that way?
because experiencing a place has got to be at the root of everything we do, and trying to understand it and trying to distill a project down to our common experiences. So I think that that when you walk the site and you observe it and you spend time perhaps you talk to the people from a community that have nothing to do with the project. Right. You see where they eat. You see how they use their city. You see how they use their town. You see how they use their site. Eladia and I are actually working on a project together where I don't think we could have started that project any other way. But walking the site is really starts to connect you deeply, and brings to the fore the responsibility you have as a designer, that you are going to be impacting this place. So it starts with that, and I think we also spend a lot of time doing, and Dawn mentioned research. Some of our research gets a little bit deep. We end up doing when we dig in, we start looking at the paleohistory of land,
Really?
and all of a sudden you start to understand the knock-on impact of where you are. Sometimes you're working on a project, say at the waterfront of Toronto, but if you don't look at our ravine systems, if you don't look at the moraine, if you don't understand the watershed of Toronto, then you don't understand being on the shore. And so you start to look, we like to take the mile high, not even the mile high, but the 20,000 perspective, and then come back in and then understand the history of the land and the people who were there. So you understand how a place was settled, you understand where a grid came from, you understand all of that. And we do this almost with every project. And then we get very specific with respect to the communities we're working with. We're doing a building for mathematicians at the University of Waterloo, and talking to them about math is amazing. And then you start to pull these threads of understanding how you understand what matters to them and how you can reflect that in how you start to look at architecture. And I think in that way you start to build buildings that mean something to communities. And if you do that with every aspect of what you're doing, including the material choices that you're working with for projects. And to touch briefly on something we talked about before, form and function, I love that you were talking about the functionality of materials, what they want to do, and how you use those materials in a way that is conducive to what those materials want to do. And I think that for us, and for myself, the process is trying to be very, very genuine and very, very specific on each of the projects. And that starts with walking the site.
Carol, what you just said is so fascinating, because I don't think a lot of people have the insights that go behind the minds of architects when you're making all these decisions. So that was, I'm so glad that you're all sitting at this table, because I'm learning so much. But Marianne, what is your design process?
Well, I think it is similar in terms of research, and understanding the context of where you are is hugely important. And you do learn it from the guy who's repairing the fountain on the site to the people that want to show you the site because they want their building built. So there's that real kind of range of stakeholders. And I would say a lot of, to add to that is program. You're given a program, a number of spaces that have a square footage that add up to a certain gross square footage, and that aligns with the budget. And I think one of the most fascinating things is to be sure that those programmatic components are what they really need, and that they make sense, and that they will have the full utilization that the client anticipates, and whether you can have flexibility in a building, and whether you can add something that is kind of the inspiration or the glue, those spaces that are really not in the program, that are often in the movement systems. Widening a corridor so you can put a high-top table in it and kids can stand at it before they go into class, or that you've accommodated the numbers of people that are going to go in. So it's kind of programmatic invention. So it really is about, local research, it's about site, it's about program, and then it is, also being sure that you can align with the expectations in terms of budget, that you can actually get the building built. It's only happened once, but I have had a building that was double the price and wasn't, and it didn't go forward. But other times, I think we're in a time where you really, prices are changing so quickly, the cost of buildings. So it's a balance of those three things, and it's iterative. And I think as our voices mature within the profession, I think we have a lot of authority to be trusted to manage all of those aspects.
Eladia, what about you? Because I think sometimes people think that when you come up with these ideas, you're like, writing it or drawing it on the back of a napkin, or, what is your design process?
We start with step 0, which is who speaks for the territory. So we figure out which Indigenous nation occupies this land, what's happened since, who needs to come to the table to inform us about the key project success factors, which I always say are so important. We view our design role as an architect as Ashkabewis. So this is a concept shared with me by Michael Lavager, who's an Anishinaabe licensed architect working out of Minnesota. And that's sort of the role of helper or messenger, where we bring the intention of the community and manifest that into physical form using all the tools at our disposal. So we come up with really good questions in coordination with participant leaders so that we are crafting those questions together, and then we figure out what best tools to use to ask those questions to the right people. Then we listen to the answers and, all importantly, summarize in a really straightforward way, validate those results back with the participant leaders, and implement. And that is the key that often gets missed, is implementation. Because if you ask a whole bunch of good questions and you listen to the answers and then you just kind of ignore them, you're in a really bad spot where your engagement activity has completely lost its integrity, right? So we really have to focus on implementing the answers. So I think when we come back to participant leaders again and show them the concept work that we've come up with based on their insights, they almost always have a almost visceral response that this is right. And if we're not getting there, we have to go back and do some work together to get to that spot where it's like, yes, this is right for us. And that concept design, that summary of results that we heard from the participant group guides the process right through to the end. So we always touch back on that at every phase of refinement to make sure that we're still right there with them, and that we're working together, and that we are being the messengers of their priorities, their value systems, their activities that they want to welcome into the space. And then that is what ends up happening for them, because then it becomes this vibrant place of activity and life, and people feel like they are part of it, that it's theirs, and
that it belongs to them.
That it belongs to them. Yeah.
We have about 5 minutes left, but I wanted to talk about materials and the process you go into deciding which materials you use. Dawn, you proposed to use Ontario limestone for the Ottawa Public Library project. How come?
Because that library project sits on a piece of geology and topography, which is very much part of the kind of landscape. Parliament Hill that we were talking about earlier sits on this extraordinary escarpment. So the Library Parliament and the Centre Block and East and West Blocks have this amazing escarpment, an architecture shaped to the escarpment, and an architecture that through the rivers connects across the province and across the nation. And that same escarpment continues through our site, which is just to the west of Parliament. And so embedding kind of natural forms and natural systems that have to do with the place, that the genus loci, as Carol was talking about earlier, really was a way of locating that building in both the landscape and the geology, but the architectural traditions and histories in Ottawa.
And Carol, you said you prefer timber. How come?
That's an interesting topic for me. Yeah. For the last 6 years or so, I've been really embedded in a couple of significant projects that are using timber for the structure. And I definitely believe in choosing the right material for the right purpose, and the context is really important. But currently, I don't think that we can look at any material selections without really, really deeply understanding their impact to the environment. And currently, timber for the structure of buildings is really tied to both management of our forests, and we see that our entire country seems to be on fire right now, and I think forestry management is a huge part of that, and part of that is getting industry into the forest so that we can actually take care of them, as well as look at a resource that we can use in a renewable way.
How do you do that? Because I know that there's a conversation, there's a lot of things happening in this country right now. Climate change is at the top of people's minds. When you say timber, even the federal government has a plan to build several billions of trees within a certain time. But you're saying that timber is the way to go?
Timber can be part of the solution. So first of all, the deforestation across Canada is largely for industries that don't replant. So industries like mining and agriculture that replace the forest. But if you're using it as and respecting it as a material that you need for your structures, you then have the ability to replant and to manage that forest and actually take care of it as you would take care of anything that you are dependent on, right? And so I think this isn't a replacement. This isn't an exploitation and eradication possibility. This is more about a long-term resilient and regenerative approach to using a material that can be renewed. And so right now, this has been a lot of my focus right now, is to understand how we can use timber, a renewable resource, for the structures of our buildings, and to think about it in terms of understanding how that could also help us create a sense of identity across the country. I mean, the forests are different. The forest, the Douglas fir that comes from BC and the black spruce in Quebec. And so if this starts to imbue our buildings, that sense of identity, a sense of place, sense of community is actually there in the materials that we can use in the various parts of our country. And I think that actually gives us an interesting opportunity to create that sense of identity across the country as well, while looking at solutions for low carbon, embodied carbon solutions. And I'll just touch on that briefly because maybe not everyone knows. So trees embody carbon. They breathe in carbon dioxide and breathe out oxygen and retain the carbon for fiber. And so when you harvest a tree and then protect it and use it for means that we need anyway, you've then preserved that carbon in the form of a building. You've not created a new carbon emergency by using other materials that are more carbon intensive. And you've created room in the forest to replant.
This is a good place to leave it, because tomorrow we're going to be talking about how we should experience space. Again, thank you so much for your time. This has been fascinating.
Thank you.
Our guests all this week are
Eladia Smoke, Gay Shigaba Week, Principal Architect of Smoke Architecture. Carol Phillips, Design Leader and Partner at Moriyama Tashima Architects. Marianne McKenna, Founding Partner of KPMB Architects. And Dawn Schmitt, Principal of Diamond Schmitt Architects.
The agenda in the summer with Nam Kiwanuka is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.